here tonight. My name is Isabella, and I'm a supervisor here at Books Are Magic. We're so excited to have Alan Grostephan and Jen Beagin with us tonight to celebrate the launch of the Banana Wars. But before we get started, I wanted to point out some logistics for how tonight's event is going to go. If you need to use a restroom at any point, the door is located right next to the moleskin spinner on the right side of the room. We'll be doing hand-raised audience Q&A toward the end of the discussion, so start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them tight. After the talk, Alan will be signing and personalizing books at the table next to where you checked in over there. And if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of the Banana Wars online using the link in the live stream description. Now, this is a very special one tonight, as Alan is a great friend of mine, and so I'm personally over the moon to be celebrating the release of this book. Here's a little bit about it. Set in Oruba, Colombia in the 1990s, Grostephan expertly weaves in and out of the lives of banana workers, an executive, a gutsy widow, sex workers, and quite a few traders. With perfect sentences and incredible visuals, Banana Wars is an electrifying work of historical fiction about fear and strength and the things people do to survive through years of abrupt violence and unrest, begging us to wonder, what is it all for? Alan Grostephan is the author of Bogota, a novel chosen by the Wall Street Journal as one of the best 10 books of fiction in 2013 and long-listed for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize. He was the winner of the Zank Prize for Fiction and is also the editor and translator of Stories of Life and Death, a collection of writing by emerging Colombian writers. Additionally, he is an incredible professor of creative writing and editing at Agnes Scott College, where I was lucky enough to be his student. He lives in Georgia. Nice. As I mentioned earlier, Jen Beagin joins Alan Grostephan in conversation tonight. Jen is a recipient of a Whiting Award in fiction. Her first novel, Pretend I'm Dead, was shortlisted for the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize, and Vacuum in the Dark was shortlisted for the Bollinger Everyman Wodehouse Prize for Comic Fiction. She's also the author of Big Swiss, named a Best Book of the Year by the New Yorker, Time, NPR, Vogue, Cosmopolitan, The Huffington Post, among others. She lives in Hudson, New York. So without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Alan Grostephan and Jen Beagin.
Thank you, Izzy. Izzy's a very, very beloved student from Agnes Scott College, where I taught. And yeah, we've become good friends, right? Sort of rare. We've celebrated Thanksgiving together. I think you even came to dinner when my parents were in town, which is a rare opportunity, right? And yeah, I just want to thank my great mentors, Christine Scott, who's here, who I love, great writer, great teacher. And the editor of my first book, Mike Levine, is here, so I want to thank him too. And obviously my friend Jen, we go way back. And
Mike was the editor of my first book as well.
Wow.
Yes, we do go way back.
We read each other, I don't know, help each other out. So,
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks to everybody for coming. Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and read, without saying anything about the book, just the very start of it, and not even the whole first chapter, but just a little fragment of the first chapter, which, I guess I'll say one thing. I mean, you'll know this immediately, but it's a strike on the banana plantations, and it's a violent strike, which is being assisted by a guerrilla group, and this is set in 1990, and this is sort of the place that Izzy mentioned, Urabá, which is Colombia's, I think, busiest and most productive banana zone. Bananas are grown all over the place in the country, but this is the spot where everywhere you look, it's a banana plantation. And so at this moment, 1990s, yeah, everything's sort of coming to this point of, I would say, just conflict. And we'll talk about what follows that a little bit. So the other, before I read that chapter, there's an epigraph by a Colombian journalist and essayist named Alberto Salcedo Ramos. And I'm going to read the translation of the epigraph, which I think sets up the book. And now she says that she is still bleeding, but in the village, since the time of the massacre, there's no permanent clinic or doctor. I watched her in silence. I close my notebook. I say goodbye to her and I move away, trying to walk carefully and not slip on the steep hill. I see muddy streets. I see a mangy dog. I see a shack with bullet holes in the wall. And I tell myself that the paramilitaries and guerrillas, despite being a pack of killers, are not the only ones that have trampled these poor people. And that's from one of his great essays, The Town That Survived a Massacre to the Sound of Flutes. All right, so I'm going to move on to mine. So the section is The Strike, 1990, chapter 1. They came down from the mountains and across the fields on horses and motorcycles and trucks and on foot. They blocked the road to the ocean and blew apart the bridge over Rio Curulao that connected plantations to the port in Turbo and the canal in Nueva Colonia. Before dawn, they invaded the fields of the first banana plantation, Finca La Bella, and cut the head-high cables for transporting banana stems, then attacked the empty office, dousing it with gasoline its desks and shelves and ledgers that contained salary numbers and an inventory of how many bananas planted and how many boxes shipped and with what exporter. They tossed gasoline across wall maps with little red pins to mark the fumigations and blue pins to mark the next rows due for harvest and shipment. A terrified security guard, an old man with a rusty Winchester, a double-chambered shotgun, emerged from the bathroom, and they handcuffed him, slid a blindfold over his eyes, and later dropped him on the outskirts of Apartado, where he was lost for a day. They doused the packing area, the high stacks of flattened banana boxes, the rubber conveyor belt, the steel tubs, the thatched roof of the cafeteria, and the little store that sold drinks and sandwiches. Next to the giant steel tubs, they cut all 9 cables that united in the packing area and spread out on a grid across the fields. They poured a trail of gasoline out to the road, and the leader, Samuel Yuletis, aka Orejas, dropped the match, as he dreamt of doing as a child. The grass and gravel lit up blue and orange, and as fast as he could blink, the whole conglomeration of buildings and awnings were on fire, and in a state of their greatest beauty and vitality, like the open eyes of a man right before death. The heads of nails Orejas had pounded into the wood glowed brightly in the fire. He still had little white scars on his hands from when he used to sweat in these fields for Mr. Morris, and his comandante had allowed him this pleasure, to burn down the thing he had helped build. Though he wanted to stay and admire it, there was no time. It was dawn, the sun already pushing over the sierra to the east, and there were more plantations to burn. Simultaneously, Gerardo Reyes, his manager of Finca La Bella, was dragged from the doorway of his house in Apartado, and a guerrilla in plainclothes with a red bandana over his face shot him twice in the side of the head so that his skull fell apart on the pavement, while his wife and children hid under the bed. 5 other managers were murdered in their beds or doorways while their plantations burned, and word traveled fast among the workers, the grunts, the dirty ones, the slaves, the illiterates, the strong-wristed, the ones with 2 machetes strapped to their waists, the ones who inhaled pesticides from the plains, who killed snakes in the drainages, who broke their backs dragging the stems on cables. That today was not just an insurrection against the planters, but a general strike across the country. The guerrillas set fire to the graveled runways and the airplane hangars. In Apartado, they burned down the Banana Corporation office with its computers, typewriters, fax machines, file cabinets, telephones, maps, inventories, and little family photos taped to the sides of desks. They surrounded the factory that made the blue plastic bags for the banana stems, and the other one that made the cardboard banana boxes. Here they shot Armando Benavides, a security guard who raised his shotgun, not realizing that the factory was surrounded by men with better guns and a plan. The cardboard and raw paper and chemicals made it all burn fast. The aluminum siding of the factory melted and collapsed, a gaping hole forming where flames curled out in search of fuel. The expensive machines all burned, and this was a pleasure for the guerrillas. The more money the planters lost, the more they would feel the shame of their position. Here and there, they exchanged fire with soldiers who were caught off guard, despite their informers, and found themselves trapped at the base of the 17th Brigade in Carepa, receiving reports that the guerrillas had cut cables and set fire to Finca San Jorge, Finca Maria del Rosario, Guaro 1 and 2, and Finca Villa Alicia. How many guerrillas were out there? More than anyone had anticipated. The fire was either fascinating or horrible, depending on who was looking at it. The thick black smoke rising from the fields, the cement walls painted with the acronyms of their groups. For some, the smoke tasted like progress, a better salary, and justice against the planters for killing workers and union leaders. For others, for some of those who worked on those same plantations, for the wives of the dead managers, for the pilots of the fumigation planes, it smelled like the end of everything, the tenuous order that held them together over the past couple years. It smelled like war. While a few trees near the packing areas caught fire and burned, the wet, fertile soil around the bananas, mounted on humps of soft earth along the drainages, did not burn. But the bananas that were supposed to be shipped that day began to ripen on their stems. The rhythm of the operation, measured down to the hour and minute, was interrupted. It would not resume for 45 days. Every field from Chigoroloa to the ocean would have to be cleared, the stems and leaves and roots, all of it chopped down and hacked into fertilizer. Not far up the road from Finca La Becha was Finca Los Bongos, where guerrillas set fire to the 4 buildings in the packing area, including the old encampment, where the workers used to live with no privacy, shat in holes and cooked over fires. Now it was a place to store equipment, and there was also a tractor trailer with a couple pickup trucks. Into their gas tanks, Orejas shoved fuses. Someone said they should siphon the gas first and sell it at the port in Turbo. But Orejas, nicknamed for his big ears and knowledge of so much hearsay, a sea-like memory with the names of people who had crossed him in his 20 years since birth, his mother's ex-boyfriends, his brother's enemies, the names and origins of every prostitute at La Picardía, so you had to be careful what you said around him, said the more gas, the louder the boom, and he wanted to hear it. His younger brother had worked here when it belonged to the German, and after Mr. Morris had fired Orejas, he had begged for work at this same office. Orejas unraveled the waxy fuse to join the others, told everyone to move past the gate to the road, and he lit a match. The boom was exquisite. The guerrillas flinched and a couple ducked behind a tree, but kept their eyes open. The cab of the tractor trailer levitated for a moment over a spring of blue flames and smashed through the roof of the packing area. Orejas was mesmerized. It woke him up even more, and he knew the planters, safe in Medellin, would see it in photos and know he was more trouble to them than La Vacuna they should be paying, and the workers they should stop killing. It was payback for the massacres at Finca Honduras, La Negra, and Punta Coquitos. It was power in its purest light. You could burn down all the temples and cathedrals and all the scriptures and all the statues of saints and even the equestrian statues of the liberators and conquerors who thought themselves gods but were just opportunists. You could burn the rich in their cars. You could drag Mario Zuluaga Espinel, the owner of Finca San Jorge, and rub his face in the ashes for the murder of 20 workers. You could sink the gringo ships over the water. You could dynamite the policemen trapped within their sandbag bunkers. While most towns in Colombia were built with a main plaza and a cathedral, a bell and a tower to be rung for mass, the towns in Urabá had no design, no sacred places. They were all ramshackle, one street dug into another, one neighborhood spilling out the backside of a banana field. Orejas believed they were all meant to be burned.
That's great. You're a great reader.
Thanks.
That's obviously happened in real life.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of what, there were strikes constantly, and plantations were burned. And a plantation is, there's just one like packing area, right, where they cool the bananas and wash the bananas and cut the bunches. There's not a whole lot to burn, but they have to put all those bananas into cardboard boxes, and they're burnable, right? So they're sort of burning what's there, as much damage as you can do. And then, of course, when you shut down the operation, all the bananas go bad in the fields. So it's like, I don't know, a 4-month growing period that's just completely lost, right? So that's sort of what I'm trying to describe, is that that destruction.
Yeah. That's great. So you did a lot of research for this novel. And both traveling to the place where it's set and, other historical research. And I don't know, do you want to talk a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So in a way, I feel like the first inklings of this book were way back when I was living in Bogota in 2001. I was in Bogota for about 3 years then, and it was a strange kind of precarious period in the Colombian Civil War, and that the government had created this safe zone to negotiate with guerrillas. And then right when I arrived, everything broke down. The guerrillas hijacked a plane with a senator and landed that plane up in the countryside and kidnapped him. And so then the government said this is an all-out war, right? And places like Urabá, this is in 2001, they'd already been through 10 years of war and things were really rough there. But some of my very close friends in Bogota were from there. They had sort of grown up in this banana zone, and they'd tell me some stories, and it wasn't really a good time for me to travel there, and for anybody really. It was just totally paramilitarized, which we can talk about at some point what that means, right? It's not just men with guns controlling politics, it's also, there's a whole moral code, right? I mean, they're controlling every aspect of a town, and you know, anything that happens, they're in charge of it. So that was sort of the first idea, you know, just kind of hearing those stories and being curious about it. And then in 2018, I traveled there and started meeting with family and friends and contacts from these people I'd known forever, very close friends, and went to some banana plantations, spent a lot of time in the city of Apartado, and Apartado is sort of I would say the business or administration capital of the banana zone. It's where all the hotels and restaurants are, and it's a weird thing in that the banana industry drives the economy of Urabá and Apartado, and then also the Gulf cartel. So like the cocaine trade all leaves through there, and there's really just one cartel that controls everything. So all the money and everything that happens is in some way connected to those two businesses, right? The illicit and then the legal one. So I did that. I started going there, and I've gone every year since. Like, I haven't stopped going. I finished the book, and I just can't stop going. I've become very close friends with certain people there, and the book is dedicated to a very old friend of mine, Nilda Jimenez Pineda, and she's one of 20 brothers and sisters, and I've just been, very close with her and her family, and so I know more things have come of that. But besides that, I read the history, and one of the books that I cite at the very end of the book, which is kind of worth mentioning because it was such a gem, is this Clara Inés Garcia's Urabá Region, Región Actores y Conflictos, so Region Actors in Conflict, 1960 to 1990. And what she covers historically is just the foundation of a banana zone, which is in 1960, and how in those 30 years, everything leads to what I just read to you, right? I mean, the sort of buildup of, labor unrest, exploited workers, and at some point the planters deciding that the way they want to deal with labor unrest is to just kill people, right? To go and kill union leaders, go into banana worker neighborhoods and just, take out 20 people and kill them in a way that's also terrorizing, right? Cut people's heads off and things like that. And so that's what's led to this moment of where the book begins, right? Where the guerrillas and the unions are just, they're fighting back against them. So anyway, and then besides
the person you dedicated the book to had family who's...
Well, yeah, I mean, what's fascinating about her story is, so at the time the book opens in 1990, Urabá is controlled pretty much completely by one or two guerrilla groups. And her family, they all grew up on a pretty big farm, right, with just sort of a classic farm where they were raising cows and plantains and had some banana crops. They were displaced by the guerrillas. So one of her brothers was killed by guerrillas. Her house was painted with guerrilla acronyms. And then the guerrillas gave them a 24-hour notice, and they all moved to the city. They moved to Apartado, so a big town. And her father, Samuel, bought a banana plantation just outside of Apartado, and that became sort of the family's salvation, right? He sold at a very low price the family farm and had to split the family of 20 kids into two sections. One went to one place, one went to the other. And then at some point in 1994, 95, when the planters were beginning to take action against the guerrillas by bringing in their own army, they kind of made him an offer he couldn't refuse, that he had to join up and offer his land, collaborate, and essentially become part of the paramilitaries, and he said no and was murdered. So he was on his way to work at the banana plantation, just got his car stopped, and he was killed. And so, and the story of exactly who killed him and why, at the moment everyone thought it was the guerrillas. He'd been harassed by guerrillas forever, and then as time passed in 2006, the paramilitary surrendered. And part of their surrender to get amnesty, and they got a lot of amnesty for everything they did, was to confess everything. And so some guerrilla commander confessed to her father's murder, and she got a phone call one day from the government and said, "Hey, we just got a confession to your dad's murder." Her head exploded. She had no idea, this is what had happened. So
Anyway, you met her by chance, though.
Well, she and I met at a wedding in Bogota. Yeah.
Okay.
So we sort of
In 2001.
just through friends. Yeah.
But what were you doing in Colombia in 2001? Like, what were you doing down there? Cocaine.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of a weird story. I was there partly because I just graduated college, and it felt like I was interested in the war. I was interested in reporting, and so I worked for a magazine that's now defunct. But I wrote some articles about the war and about, particularly like one about coca fumigation in southern Colombia, and I was also working south of Bogota in a neighborhood where people who had been displaced from other parts of the country came to live. And actually, Bogota, my first novel, is about that to some degree. It's about that neighborhood, and it's about a kind of a specific story of a family that does this sort of classic thing, which is they're terrorized in the countryside and moves to the city, tries to find work and get by. But that's sort of the start. I was working as a journalist, and then somehow that began to be a job. I was in this.
You already spoke Spanish.
I did, yes.
You learned Spanish in high school?
Well, in high school, and then I went abroad as an undergraduate. So yeah, I studied in Spain and Chile.
Okay. Cool.
Yes.
Yes, you spoke Spanish already. Just wondering.
Yeah.
Okay, that question's done. Okay, so we both write about violence and sex.
Right.
Why is that? What's the challenge for you writing about, violence? I mean, I want like 3 things from a book. Often is the fighting and the fucking and the food.
Right.
And you have all of those, and right?
I think we both write food. Some people forget that people eat, and food is
That's
prepared, and it smells, and
Yes.
we both always have the food.
That's right. And sex, right?
Definitely, yeah.
I do most like emotional violence and sexual violence, but your book was so graphic, and with physical violence, and I really loved it about it, and what was like the challenge for you in writing the
I
violence?
think the trick with violence, which I don't know, maybe you've thought of, is to not overdo it, right? I mean, it's sort of, how much detail do you need to evoke like a violent moment or a violent act, and yet you don't want to write it so coldly that the reader doesn't feel it at all. And so how does it feel like in the body? How does it feel like in memory? And where do people look? And I think one of the things that I understand, at least about a traumatic moment, is that there's some way to get through it, right? That you sort of guide yourself through it, and then you got to deal with the results of it. But what is that like? And so it's sort of my, particularly the latter part of the book, what happens in Udava, it's already kind of a violent place, as I read to you, when the guerrillas are not a beloved guerrilla group. I know there's stories in countries and places where guerrillas are protecting people, and they're doing good things to represent people against multinational companies and landowners and things like that. And I'm not saying it was all negative, but in general, the stories you hear in Udava is that this guerrilla was a criminal group. I mean, they were extorting money from everybody, and was not a very beloved group, especially at the point where the book starts. Anyway, so what happens when the paramilitaries come, there's this clash, and the paramilitaries carry out what they call in Colombia cleansing. And the cleansing is to seek out anybody at all connected with the guerrillas. And so I think part of the violence in the book is just that fear that there's this constant paranoia of just looking over your shoulder, and that you're going to be cleansed because you live in a certain neighborhood or your cousin works at a certain banana plantation or whatever. And so I was trying to sort of inhabit that kind of level of tension and fear day after day. How do you go to work every day? How do you cook your food? And how do you get through it? And I think people keep fucking, right, through all this. They keep eating food and, you know, so I thought also that when life goes on, right, everybody, you have to keep living and find pleasure, and everyone's full of desire. And
yeah, you capture that really well.
how do you do it? I mean, I feel like one of the things I remember from Big Swiss is that you write that scene where Big Swiss is attacked, and it's very, like, meticulously described. Like, it's very painful. You don't pull any punches at all.
Yeah, no. Well, that was loosely based on someone I know, so I, had some material to draw from. But the stabbing that takes place later in the book, I remember Googling, guy gets stabbed a bunch of times and lives, and see what came up, and just to see, like, because I've never been stabbed or seen anyone get stabbed, so. Yeah, I read some articles about it, people that got stabbed a bunch of times, and I went. But there's so much violence in this book. I just wondered, how's he coming up with this shit? Is he Googling newspaper articles or what?
Yeah.
No.
I think I think sure I read a lot of testimony. I read a lot of oral history, and one of the things that happened is I was traveling to this specific place in Colombia is that people really wanted to tell me their story, and they wanted to tell me really hard stories, and they wanted to do it in their houses or on the road, like somewhere where nobody was listening. We could never talk in an open cafe. Everybody's still super paranoid, right? And there's still people listening.
You couldn't record them.
Yeah, I just didn't need to. I was writing a novel. I didn't feel like I wasn't writing journalism. I wouldn't even usually take notes in the moment. I would sort of absorb it all day, and then I would wake up the next morning and have a coffee and write down everything I remembered. And at least back then I had a good memory. My memory's falling apart, but at that point it was really good.
This was 2018.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Pre-pandemic memory.
That's right.
So and I think I probably represented just somebody who, I was not a player. I had no interest in hurting anybody by knowing their history about a family member or something that had happened to them.
But at that point, were you like, I'm writing a book?
Oh, sure. I told people I was there studying the history, and that I was a writer and all that. And it was, most of the people, I was a big mix, but I remember it was mostly men who were killed, and so I was talking to a lot of widows, a lot of sisters, a lot of people just connected in that way. So,
All right, at the end of the book, you acknowledged a number of novels that were important to you as you wrote.
Oh yeah.
But you already mentioned one of those.
Well, I mentioned the history books. I mean, I think besides the research, for the history of the book, I don't know, from the 1960s all the way through, there were a lot of books about. There's been a lot written about paramilitary groups in Colombia, who paid for them, how they function, why they function, right? And it's an awful history, but it is fascinating in that the war benefits people with money. I mean, it benefits the people who were investing and wanting to invest, or opportunists, right? People who wanted to come in. And so once there's all this disarray, right? I mean, the same story of my friend Anilda's family. When her father was killed, immediately all his land got stolen. And the people who took that land were businessmen, right? In Medellin. And so the banana plantation that he had gotten to, make ends meet after they were displaced, fell into the hands of their next door neighbor, and who was very powerful and buddies with the Colombian president. And so my friend Anilda's sister and her mom and a couple of her brothers took a bus to Medellin and went to his office and sat down, and they're like, you took our land, can we get it back? And he's like, it belongs to me now. And he had a big sheaf of bills and debt. He said, your dad owed me money, I helped him out when he was kidnapped, and he, I bought all this fertilizer and pesticides and all this stuff, and he's like, it doesn't belong to you. And then her mom kind of got the subtext of that meeting, which was, if you keep coming, you're gonna die. I'm gonna kill more of your kids. I'll kill your kids or kill you. And the mom said, we're done. And this is sort of how the paramilitaries tried to legitimize things. They got people to sign off their titles, and they would say, hey, I'm going to pay you $2,000 for your land, but I'm only going to give you $500 up front. And then when you come for the next $1,500, it's understood that you better walk away, right? And so land changed hands, right? I mean, all over the place. And when all the dust settled after the war and things kind of got calmed down and there's less violence, definitely today, you look around and the land restitution program is like flooded with people who have lost their farms and flooded with people who are just all these different tricks, right? So in a way, the guerrillas, taking out the guerrillas, defeating the guerrillas, turns into this pretext to just steal all this land from everybody and create these different economies, not just bananas, but African palm oil. They're now mining for cobalt, right, up on the water near my friend Nila's farm and just stuff like that. So there's lots of economic interest in this. And I've also, one of the things that I guess I haven't said about the book, the character you meet right away, Orejas, so he's a banana worker, and you kind of hear his whole story, like how he grew up working in banana plantations. You also hear about how he joined the guerrilla and why, right? How did he end up at a guerrilla meeting and where does he go from there? And one of the things that happened when the paramilitaries came in is they hired a lot of ex-guerrillas. And so he, because they knew who the comrades were, right? And they knew how to fight. And so he's one of those guys who sells out his buddies, right? He goes over to the other group. But anyway, mixed in with him are the business interests. There's an American banana businessman in the book. There's a Colombian banana planter in the book who's in Medellin. And then there's another character on the ground, and she's initially in the book has a bakery, and her husband is a guerrilla, and he's killed, and she ends up in the banana industry as well. So there's kind of that mix of people, but one of the things I tried to do in the book, which is, I don't know, difficult, but is to show how business works and how violent, the violence is actually in these cubicles, in these conference rooms, in these phone calls, right? Yeah. And, one of the things that people talked about, at least in the guerrilla period, right, I think I probably mentioned it what I just read, or it's in that chapter, is the phone ringing, right? The phone just rings and your manager is dead. And this would happen at certain plantations over and over again. It was like the planters are all, in safe houses in Medellin. They're not they never see their land. And there's that call over the phone, and then there's like ledgers and numbers, and how does that contain violence? So, yeah.
Sorry. What else do I want to ask you? Are you gonna keep writing about Colombia? I wonder. What are you working on now?
I just finished an essay that is, hey, Carlos got here. But I just wrote a piece that is about an art installation in Bogota by Doris Salcedo. In fact, Carlos here, who knows art, it's good timing. And what she has done, this is kind of what I'm working on now, is she was hired because she's a very famous Colombian artist by the government to create a monument to the Civil War. And she definitely didn't want to make a monument of people with guns, right? Men with guns on horses or whatever, right? So instead, she told the government that she wanted all the rifles that the guerrillas turned in, right? This is in 2016, and they gave her 37 tons of steel, right? 37 tons of rifles and pistols and weapons and stuff. And so she melted it down into these slabs and created a big kind of floor out of it in Bogota. So anyway, I visited that last summer. And
a floor.
Yeah, it's essentially you walk on this exhibition. And besides, the melting and the creation of the slabs, she then invited women who were victims of sexual violence to come and pound and shape those slabs, right? So gave them hammers and different tools to kind of, just hammer away at that metal, and they were apprehensive about it, but then in the way she tells the story, they got into it, right? This cathartic act of participating. So if you go to the show, their names are on the show. You know, they're collaborators with her. So I've written about that, and then I've been, you know, spending so much time hearing the story, and I'm working on a documentary with my friend Anil about her father and the story of the family, that I've kind of mixed those two things together, and how an anti-monument that is supposed to memorialize war actually does very much capture or translate her history, right, and her family's history, right? That if you look at those steel slabs carefully and know what's beneath them and what they contain, you know about Anilda waking up in the middle of the night when she's 10 years old and a gorilla has come through her window and put a gun to her head, right? And then dragged her out in the living room where her father is lying in a pool of blood, and they're trying to, you know, round up the whole family and take some of their money, and they were looking for his guns. That's the reason they woke her up. They're like, where does your dad keep his guns, right? So those same guns they're looking for, the same guns they're using, to me are melted in that monument in Bogota, right? Which is also like tucked into like a corner in Bogota that's hard to get to. The government like commissioned it, and they're like, oh shit, let's hide this away, right? You know, this doesn't look too good.
Right.
Yeah, so good intentions, but yeah.
You noticed.
I did know.
Maybe you and I should say something about how we met, right? Should we?
Yeah, I mean,
Is
do
it
you
kind of
really
fun?
want to?
I don't know. Well, but let me tell you how I met Jen, and this is kind of fun because one of the things that happens when you go to graduate school is, at least for me, one of my hopes was to meet other writers. I didn't have any writer friends, and not that many people are reading and writing, right? So if you're reading a lot of books, you don't have anyone to talk about them with unless you find those people, right? And so, you know, I was living in San Francisco at the time and applied to graduate school, ended up at University of California, Irvine. And I think it was my third year, which is a year where you're mostly just writing. And then you showed up for your year, your first year, and then Michelle Lacholet, one of our great professors and mentors, introduced us. She said, and she kind of felt like I had to meet you. She's like, I'm really excited about this person, right? And it was at that awkward cocktail to begin the year, right? Everybody's standing around just pounding free drinks, right?
I don't remember this.
Okay,
Go on.
Yeah. And I could tell you were not comfortable. You were not happy to be there. Like you looked like you were ready to run out the door, right?
I was.
Because you probably just found out you had to teach, right?
I did. Yeah. And I'm not good at speaking off the top of my head. Maybe you've noticed. So I was.
So anyway, I met you. You were getting nervous. I was like, all right, maybe we'll meet again, you know. And then midway through that fall, you gave a reading, and you read a piece from Pretend I'm Dead. You read the Taos, New Mexico stuff.
I did, yeah.
And I liked it a lot, and I liked how you read. I mean, I know you don't love giving readings, but and then we went to the bar, and then we started talking, and I went home and told Maria about you, and I was like, hey, I met this woman.
This is not what I remember.
Okay, so your memory. This is how memory works, yeah.
That I was supposed to teach, and I like taught a couple classes. I was shaking violently, and like I just like could not do it. So I was like, I think I need to exit the program. It was like kind of a cool idea, but it's just not going to work for 3 years. I can't do it. So but then someone sent me to you, and you were like, no.
According to you, Alberto sent you.
Yeah,
right?
Alberto
that I was
sent me.
the fixer here.
Yeah, and you fixed it. You were like, what do you need? I'll give you all my syllabi. And you did. You gave me all your syllabi and notes.
I have no memory of this either. Invented, but I mean, I look good. It's a good look for me. This story.
I wrote out scripts for myself so I could like teach, and it was all your stuff. And I just pretended to be Alan. And it worked. Yeah.
You survived.
Yeah, I survived. Yeah. And then we became great friends.
That's right.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you want to say anything about Michelle? And I mean, who's sort of the founder of that program, at least in our time period, and I think embraced. The only thing I would like to say about her is just that she's one of those readers. This is our kind of key professor there who. I mean, you never knew what she was going to say. I think you walk into a writing workshop and sometimes everybody's got a similar reading, and she would read something and notice something that like it was so important and it hadn't occurred to anybody, right? And she did this thing that everybody talks about doing, like whether it's like visiting an artist's studio or reading a writer's writing, which is that you're trying to accept it or interpret it based on its own terms, right? You're trying to read it within its world, right? And she actually knew how to do that, right?
Yeah,
I mean, she really read everything in a way that respected what it was and dealt with it on those terms. So yeah, that's my memory of her. That, and still, she's, you know, her name is on the back of my book, which she and I exchange writing. She's a good friend.
No, she's great. Yeah, I remember writing a sex scene for a workshop, and there was going to be a threesome. And earlier in the scene, Mona, the protagonist, was like had her period, and then there was this threesome, and I totally forgot about it. She's like, "What about the blood?" I was like, "Fuck, you're right." So I had to like write it in there. Yeah, she was like just really, yeah, she thought of everything.
She did. Yeah.
Very, very, very close reader. Yeah, she's great.
How are we doing for time? Should we ask some questions? Yeah, what are you all thinking about? You have questions for either of us?
And if we have questions, can we just repeat them so that people in the live stream?
Oh yeah,
can
for
hear?
sure. Okay.
Okay.
I'll do it. I got it. Yeah,
I wanted to
Christine.
ask you about this character, Orejas.
Yeah.
He's very complex and interesting to me, and he doesn't start out. I mean, he was good with bananas.
Right.
He knew what he was doing and everything, and I was so surprised when he went over. But they all seem so helpless. When his father says to him, "You're not going to be a doctor.
Right.
That's not for you," and I, you're very good on the helpless folks, but it's really hard to see and hard to know how these people are going to get out of this. Anyway, with the one thing I wanted to mention that I just loved was when Orejas looks at his father and his father's body, and we're talking about what you've seen and everything else, you get very, very, very close to that father's body. His feet are grotesque.
Right.
And everything, I so admire how physical this book is. Its speed is great. The way it starts, it reminded me of a Cormac McCarthy kind of thing, when everybody's gathering and all these, and it's great movement forward. And yeah, I mean, it's, I'm not asking you a question actually. I'm just sort of saying, he is an utterly great character. But it's not a cheery book, and I don't know why Jen mentioned sex, because I haven't felt the sex at all.
Right.
I have really felt mostly the heads that are cracked like walnuts and things of that sort. And
Well, I think sorry, were you going to say something more?
No, I just...
Yeah. So, for the people on the stream anyway, Christine's talking about this character, Orejas, who, you know, the book opens with him. He's a banana worker at that moment, and he's also covertly involved in a guerrilla group. And shortly after that, he's promoted to becoming a banana manager. And at some point, he realizes the guerrillas are going to kill him. That he's, you know, this is sort of the paranoia of the book, is that somebody said he's a snitch, then it's true, right? And people are being, you know, it's in a very hard period in the history. So he goes to the paramilitaries for a very different situation, where you get a salary, you get a lot of power, and he becomes this sort of connecting person who connects the paramilitaries with the banana planters. I mean, I think the only thing I would want to add to what you're saying, Christine, about him is that him and his father and how he grows up working hard, right? Working long days, working in the sun. It's really hot in this spot, and being in the sun in the fields is tough. And I think that's just something I'm interested in, right? I mean, work, like what it does to the body.
Yes.
What happens to you mentally all day, doing repetitive work, dragging banana stems in. I mean, the people who haul the stems in on those cables through the fields. I mean, banana fields are all just woven with cables, right, that are about head high. if you have no bananas, you just hook up your pulley and they call it, you're riding your Toyota, they call it a Toyota, and you just fly across the fields. But then once you hook up a bunch of stems, you got to drag them in, right?
It's like a zip line.
Yeah, it's a zip line, but yeah, once you've hung a bunch of heavy stems, you become almost like a mule, just dragging in this stuff. And so I think
You have to drag it in manually.
you do, and I think for somebody like Orejas and a lot of people at some point who are tired of the hard work, it's like, what's a way out of this, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do I get some power and I can stop? Yeah, I mean, how do I? So, yeah, and with respect to the sex, I think there is sex in the book, but it's sort of not pleasurable, right? I mean, in Big Swiss, there's, like Orejas is kind of initiated by his father. He takes him to a
Yes.
brothel and a partaló, but it's just confusion for him, It's, I mean, that's also based on a story of a friend of mine. His father also took him very young to a brothel. And he was
Yes.
totally confused and unsettled by it, but he had to do this rite of passage, right, with his father. And so, yeah, it's sort of kind of abusive, right? And so I want that kind of tension in him having to do that. And, and going out drinking with the men, right? Going out and being a part of that sort of macho after work culture where you burn a whole week's salary
Yes.
on women and beer and all that. Whereas in Big Swiss, there's actually pleasurable sex, right? I mean,
Is it?
there is some, not all of it, right?
I think there's a lot more fun in Big Swiss.
Right.
Yeah, no, it's more fun.
What else? Any other questions? Yeah, Mike.
I'm going to ask a deeply uninformed question. When you were talking about the history of the banana business in Colombia, it made me think of that concept, which is also maybe the name of the book, except I think I have a word wrong, by Naomi Klein, something like disaster capitalism. That's not the phrase, though, or is it? Shock, yes. Where I just wondered if you had knew anything about that book and this. She's got this whole very detailed history of how more businesses than you could ever imagine sort of thrive on all kinds of disasters all over the world. Like something horrible happens, either a natural disaster or a man-made one. And it's almost always a way for a certain group of people to make a huge pile of money.
Yeah.
And so it kind of, that's what I kept thinking about when you were describing it, that it.
I mean, I was just reading a book about Mexico and how there are certain areas where different drug cartels are disputing territory, and then when the Mexican government sends in the military to clean house, right, take out whatever cartel is, causing the most problems, suddenly the multinational companies and different Mexican businesses, like whether it's an oil field or some other mineral or whatever, it's all controlled. Like small farmers have lost their land, and next thing you know, there's an oil refinery or whatever. That sort of, there's all this dust, this big smoke screen of a conflict. It's a cartel violence, and then the military comes in, takes out the key people, and suddenly.
So does it, in Colombia, does it work like just basically an effective kind of barrier between this group that has all the money and owns all the capital, and then just the rest of the population?
I mean, the most violent places in the Civil War, and even today, are the places with all the resources.
Yeah.
That's where the armed groups are. Like the region south of Cali, which is southern Colombia, El Cauca, has never not been violent, right? And the guy who authorized the killing of my friend Emila's father, whose name is Eber Velosa, HH was his war name, and he confessed to 3,000 murders, which is a lot. And he was what they called the Comandante del Bloque Bananero. So he was the commander of the banana block, or the banana region. And when he had all the success, right, took control of all the urban, the municipal towns, the main towns and all this, and had control of the roads and the shipping routes, they sent him south of Cali to El Cauca. And he did atrocious things. Like he massacred indigenous populations. But they thought, wow, you've been so successful in the banana zone, why didn't you go down there? And where all these mining operations, the coffee is grown, the cocaine is grown there, like coca is grown there. And so, yeah.
Wow.
It's bleak.
Yeah, I wanted to say, like, maybe to go back to the idea of fun, and like your book is more relentless than it is the fun, and I think maybe it's like a sense of responsibility or something that you carry for the stories that you've heard.
I think you're right. Yeah, I mean, I think if, and I think this was a hard thing about people who, you know, for reading Bogota as well, right? It's a sad story. And I feel like writing kind of easy solutions to really hard lives, like impossible situations, is unfair in some ways. It's not real. You know, it's not that people don't get out. In fact, I think, I don't know how you felt, Christine, but I feel like there is, in a way, that the character Jennifer kind of does overcome some things at the end of the book. And I felt that, you know, that's also real. Some people do get out and play their cards right and all that. I mean, and there is, like, of course, day by day, it's not all bleak, right? It's not all relentless. People are having fun and, you know, joking around with their friends, of course. But yeah, I don't want
feel
to.
like the tenderness in the book maybe is about sometimes like women coming together and caring for each other in these beautiful ways, like doing favors,
Yep.
or you know, looking out for how they look even and things like that. But maybe with the men in the book, yes, there is always a lot of tension related to the violence.
Yeah, I don't know. This might be true. Like I was saying, my friend Anilda has 20 brothers and sisters, and the men are all disasters, by the way. I mean, they've all had so many problems, and everything they try to manage with the family land and whatnot. The women have taken total control. The women are the brains of the operation. It's caused a huge scandal in the countryside. So they've gotten one of the farms back, and when the villagers, people around there came in and saw the women giving orders, they like threw their machetes and walked away. They were so pissed off, right? Just the sort of the patriarchal tradition out there, because they're ranchers and it's jungle and all that. But yeah, I mean, at this point, everybody knows. Anilda and Elubina and Nelly, her sisters, they're the ones in charge, right? They're the ones who can manage the money and kind of have the foresight to make good business decisions. And yeah, so I think, anyway, that's probably in the book a little bit too. Yeah.
Yeah, and not to keep picking at the idea of women, but one more thing is like, I know like your mother is a psychoanalyst and she's a really good listener, and I feel like part of the way that you know how to listen and how people just like offer these stories to you is thanks to her and to that training that, you know, she kind of passed on to you. And I'm just saying this because it's not like people, my friends sometimes tell you things that they don't tell me. And I'm like, how did that happen? Yeah, it's like a mode of listening that I think really helped this book.
I think it's probably the same is true for Jen. I mean, everybody corners you and wants to tell you everything, right? I mean, this is. And you and I thrive on this. We sort of want to hear secrets. And,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Tell me more.
Even I want to tell you everything. Yeah.
You do.
And I trust you, right? I sort of
Yeah.
know you're not going to judge me or
Oh, no.
whatever. Yeah.
No judgment.
This might be. This is sort of a writer's skill. How are we doing?
I think
It's
Is
time.
that it?
I think it's
We're
time.
running out of time. Okay.
Great.
Thank you for coming, everybody.
Great.
Thank you for coming out tonight. Thanks to everyone who asked questions. Thanks to Jen Beagin for moderating. Thanks to Alan Grostephan for celebrating this launch with us. A few final reminders. If you're still with us on the live stream, you can purchase a copy of the book by clicking the link in the live stream description. For those with us in person, we have additional copies at the register. Alan will be signing and personalizing books at the alcove where my co-worker Ali is pointing to. We ask that you gather all of your things so we can start breaking down the store. And we also have copies of Big Swiss at the register too, if you don't have them yet.
Totally buy it.
Yeah, you really should. But thank you so much for coming out. We're so happy.
Good job.
Shout out to Sharon.